The last few weeks have been a little academic. I toned it down this time. One day in 1939, George Bernard Dansing, a doctoral candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, arrived just 10 minutes late for a new graduate-level statistics class, and he saw two math problems that were written up on the chalkboard. Dansing jotted them down in his ledger in a rush to catch up for class, and then the class went on as usual. 3 days later, Dansing turned in the problems, and he apologized to the professor for not finishing them sooner. But there was a bit of a problem. Paul and his young friend Timothy visited the city of Philippi on Paul's second missionary journey, and this would have been somewhere around the end of the year 51 AD. Philippi is a city on the northeast end of Greece. It's just 12 kilometers from Neapolis, right off from the water and on the river that's running out. It was to be the site of the very first Christian church in all of Europe, Philippi. Now, contrary to popular opinion, of course, Christianity is not a religion of the West. It's actually an ancient Near Eastern religion. And in any case, 10 years later, after this first church had been planted, it began to grow and it flourished. Paul wrote them a letter of encouragement. Paul writes to them, telling them how much he loves them and telling them to keep strong, to be positive. And he himself, he writes this to them again from prison. And yet Paul writes from a cell. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever you find noble, whatever's right and whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on these things. In short, Paul says, even though I know that you have troubles, you should never underestimate the power of faith and of positive attitude. He says when we face challenges, you have to keep your eyes on the faith thing and keep your eyes on the positive thing. Now, Paul is far from being alone in this. At the turn of the 19th century, a Danish author is known as Isaac Dystad. He wrote, God made the world round so we would never be able to see too far down the road. I like that, and I also think it's true. Things get really incredibly hard sometimes, but no matter what happens, this one thing is still real. And we have no idea what's coming around the curve, good or bad. The world is round. For Paul, troubles were very, very real, and they were going to keep coming, and they were going to get worse. This letter was written at nearly the same time as the book of Timothy, 2 Timothy, that we talked about last week. And so we know from the archaeological information and information from first century historians like Josephus, who are not Jews, who are not Christians, exactly what's happened here. Paul was in prison. He was in the fortress Antonia, and he was awaiting a meeting with Caesar, who would determine what would happen with him. And we know further that he was executed shortly after that. Paul was killed, though, later. He was killed under the rule of Nero in either May or possibly June of 68 AD. But here's the thing. That is nearly 6 years after Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, thinking he would die any day now. He thought his life was completely over. He wrote these letters to say goodbye and I love you, to encourage people on. And then he got 6 more years of life. The truth is, nobody has a guarantee of tomorrow. But it does us no good to live in the shadows. It does us no good to waste our time on things that make us bitter or angry. We can't just wait around with doom and gloom. Paul knows that he's going to die and that it could be any day. But he says we should put our minds on whatever is true, whatever is noble, on whatever is right or pure or lovely or admirable, whatever is excellent, whatever is praiseworthy. In other words, Marvel's director Nick Fury is correct. In one of the films, he says, "Until such time as the world ends, we will act as though it intends to spin on." We need to put our minds as much as possible on the good, and we need to go on living no matter what, like the world intends to spin around. 86-year-old Joy Johnson, a veteran of 25 New York City marathons, died back in 2013. Johnson was the oldest runner that year. She fell at the 20-mile marker in the event, but then she got up and people cheered. She makes lazy bones like me feel like I should be at the gym. And yes, she fell, but she got up and she finished. She crossed the line at 8 hours. She did it, and she did it for the 25th year in a row. Joy Johnson died that exact same day, but she died with her running shoes on. After the race, Joy returned to her hotel room for a nap. She laid down, shoes still on, and then did not get up again. Amazingly, Johnson didn't run her first marathon until she was 61 years old. Before that, she'd really never been into any kind of sport. In fact, the only hint of any kind of sport around her entire house was in the form of a Bible verse, Isaiah 40, verse 31, which hung up on a little frame in her kitchen in a farmhouse in Minnesota. It said, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up like wings of eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They will walk and not be faint." Now, ironically, this career gym teacher, Joy Johnson, was almost a complete stranger to all forms of personal exercise until she took her first 3-mile walk in 1986. A week later, she jogged, and after a while, she competed in 10K races. And by 1988, just 2 years into running, she completed the first New York City Marathon. 3 years later, she recorded her best time at the age of 64, which was 3 hours and 55 minutes, which is better than my brother-in-law's, and he's younger than me. A few years ago, she told a reporter about her exercise regime. She would wake up at 4 a.m., drink 2 cups of coffee while reading a Bible, and then she would set out on an 8-mile pre-dawn run. When you wake up, it can either be a good day or a bad day, Miss Johnson said. And I always choose it's going to be a good day. And then I put my shoes on. The devout Christian lady ran every day but Sunday so she could attend church. Johnston sang hymns to herself to pass the time while she jogged. And according to her daughter, she was always a happy runner. And besides her family and her faith, it was the thing she loved the most. I suppose it could probably serve as Joy's epitaph. She died with her running shoes on. What would you choose? What's your epitaph? Will people look back at you and say, well, she was tired and she was grumpy? Will they talk about the last conversation you had? And if they do, will it be a pleasant one? Was it a complaint session? Will they say, boy, oh boy, he was really upset about politics that last month? Or might they say that you had your mind on something true, something noble, something right, and something pure, and something admirable or excellent or praiseworthy? What will they say of you? For me, Joy Johnson is pretty inspirational. Now, don't get me wrong about this. I have no plans to start running marathons anytime soon. If you know me, you know I hate cardio. And also, have you seen the funny clothes they wear? I'm not doing that. What impresses me about Joy is that she stayed positive until the absolute very end. The world is round. And she didn't know what the coming days were going to go look like. So she just decided it was going to look like a good day. And then she died with her running shoes on. She managed to keep positive in a world that, let's be honest, sometimes it is quite hard to be positive in. Troubles are real. They're very real. And we sometimes face seemingly insurmountable odds, and sometimes, like Paul, our very lives are actually at stake, and we truly are in the last of our days, though we don't know the count. Other times, like Paul, we are gifted with a few unexpected more years, and sometimes, like Joy, like with Paul, like with everything and everyone, the dark cloud catches up a bit. But we can't be deterred. The world is round. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what's around the corner. But we can know just who is with us while we travel that road. In Philippians 4:13, Paul writes, "I can do all things through Christ who brings me strength." Or as another author put it, true common sense is seeing things as they are, perhaps, but more so as they ought to be. Chuck Swindoll put it this way: "The longer I live, the more convinced I become that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% what I do about what happens to me." Romans 12:12 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern the will of God and know what is good and acceptable and what is perfect." And in the same way, Jesus Christ himself in Mark 11:22 said, "Have faith in the Father above. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt it in his heart but believes in what he says, it will come to pass." Or in very simpler words, it just means don't let things drag you down. Don't put your mind on things that don't benefit you or things that harm other people. Don't spend your life being dragged down by the ridiculous doom and gloom of the news, telling us every day the sky is falling, but every other day having a new reason for it because the first one didn't happen. Don't fill your life with conversations unless they lift people up. Instead, put your mind on whatever's true, on whatever's noble, whatever is right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, whatever is excellent, whatever is praiseworthy. These are the things that deserve our attention and our time and our energy. No, not one of us knows when it might be our time to go, but we can all make the ever-important choice to live life with our running shoes on. Let's put our minds on the positive, because when we do, Jesus says we can move mountains. We don't know what's on the road ahead, but I bet there's mountains. He says we can do the impossible. When George Dansing handed his assignments in that day, George had no idea that there was a strange problem. George Dansing later recounted exactly what happened back in 1986 with an interview for College Mathematics Journal. And it reads like this: "It happened because during my first year at Berkeley, I arrived late one day at one of Dr. Jerzy Nesm's classes. On the blackboard there were two problems, and I believed they had been assigned for homework. I copied them down. A few days later, I went back and I apologized to Dr. Neyman for taking so long to do my homework. The problems seemed to me to be a little more difficult than usual. They had taken me 3 days, and I asked the professor if he even still wanted them. And he told me, just lay them on the desk. And I did so very reluctantly because his desk was completely covered with a heap of unorganized papers, and I feared my homework would be lost forever. But about 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, my wife Ann and I were awakened by someone banging on the front door loudly, and it was Dr. Neyman. He rushed in with a bunch of papers in his hands, excited, and said, "I've just written the introduction to your paper. Read it so I can send it for publication." For a minute, I had really no clue what he was talking about. I didn't even remember the homework from 6 weeks ago. To make a long story short, the problems on the blackboard that I had solved, thinking they were homework, were actually two famous unsolved problems in statistics and mathematics, referred to generally as the unsolvable problems. Dr. Neyman had put them up on the board to make a point that you might not be able to answer every question. They were supposed to help you deal with failure. They were supposed to be examples of the world's greatest mathematicians' problems that they had failed to figure out the worked lifetimes on. They'd been worked on for generations. I had no idea. I just thought they were a little harder, and I had to put my mind to it. The two problems took me a little under 6 hours, he says. Later, when I asked my advisor about the direction I should take for my doctoral thesis, he looked at me as if I was crazy. He pulled my 2 homework assignments out of a file, punched holes in the pages, put them in a binder, and laid it in front of me, and said, "This is your thesis, and not a single mathematician on earth will challenge it." That was my doctoral thesis, George writes. It was already done. And my advisor was correct. It went through without contest. You know what I think? I think George Dansing solved those problems because he didn't know they were supposed to be unsolvable. He had a mind that was focused on the positive, and that changed absolutely everything. The greatest minds in math and statistics had worked on them for 6 generations, and they had always assumed that they would fail when they began. And George had no such fear. He did what countless could not do. And he did it in 2 3-hour segments of homework in between doing the dishes and chatting with his lovely wife. What are we to be focused on? Where should our minds really be? What's positive? We should all be focused upon the light and not the dark. From the moment we put our shoes on in the morning, we should start by thinking this is going to be a good day. Our minds should be on whatever is true and whatever is noble, on whatever is right and pure and lovely, admirable, whatever is excellent, whatever is praiseworthy. The world is round, and we don't know what tomorrow brings. But I do know this. I plan to die with my running shoes on, full of faith and thinking very positively. Thanks be to God for His word, His encouragement.